Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Insight Weekly, an Intelligence Fusion podcast. With me this week, we've got Vincent Fevrier, who leads our coverage in the Americas.
Hi, Laura.
Max Taylor, who covers Asia and the Middle East.
Morning, Laura.
And Scott MacDonald, who will be covering Europe for us this week.
Morning, Laura.
Vincent, in the last episode of Insight Weekly, we discussed a planned arms strike by the ELN in Colombia. You want to give us an overview of kind of what went down?
Yeah, so the ELN, the far-left guerrilla group, currently quite active in Colombia, had planned an armed strike between last Friday and this Monday. They weren't the only group. The FARC dissident groups in Coca had also announced that they'd also committed an armed strike in that department, and the EPL as well, within certain areas in the northeast of Colombia. In terms of the ELN, very much like what we expected in terms of targets and methods. So they targeted a military base. There was reports of attacks on police stations, as well as roadside IEDs, mine explosions, cylinder bombs being fired from homemade mortar tubes at the military base, and sniper fire against military forces. In regards to casualties, there was the exact numbers haven't been completely tallied, but a soldier was killed by sniper fire, and there were also civilians that were wounded due to a mine explosion in a coca field.
So these sound like quite sporadic attacks with the mines and sniper attack. Do the ELN operate in the form of cells, or is it more of a centralized structure, like more of an organized group?
So they're loosely a decentralized structure, with groups kind of operating in different departments on their own accord. But there's also a centralized structure that kind of started with negotiating a peace deal with government, which kind of fell apart last year when a vehicle bomb exploded at police academy, which the ELN took responsibility. It's very kind of structure I'm not quite familiar with, so I can't kind of answer that question with kind of affirmative.
So have these peace talks caused any tensions between the cells or the individual groups and the leaders, or is this not really commonly available information?
So I think based on kind of my assessment and reading, some leaders have been against the peace talks, while some are more for them. It's kind of similar to the FARC when they demobilized, with some kind of breaking off apart and continuing their armed movement against the government because they didn't agree with peace talk. But it's hard to kind of know because of how the group's kind of decentralized in a way. It's hard to know kind of the motivation behind every leader.
Thank you, Vincent. Moving on to this week, however, a second mass murder in Mexico.
Yes. So on Monday night, 4 people were shot and killed in a motorcycle workshop in the city of Morelia in the state of Michoacan. It's all the victims were pronounced dead at the scene, and there were reports that one person was arrested, although it wasn't confirmed whether that was in connection to the murder or not. It's the second in the city of Morelia this month in terms of mass murder, which we categorize as 4+ killed in a single event without a cooling off period. But it's the third in the state of Michoacan. The first was earlier this month, I believe on the 3rd, in the city of Uruapan.
So what actually drives the violence?
So like much of Mexico, the violence is related to cartel activity, who are fighting for drug routes, drug production, as well as other criminal enterprises like kidnapping, extortion, fuel theft, although fuel theft is not as big in the state of Michoacan. In terms of Morelia itself, 2 primary groups are fighting each other in that area, the Los Viagras and the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the CJNG, and so they're the primary drivers of violence in that area. The state itself is one of the most violent states in Mexico, with last year seeing approximately 2,500 homicides, and it continues to be on the list by the U.S. State Department of one of 5 Mexican states not to travel to.
And the city of Morelia, that actually is one of the biggest cities where contributes to the state being the sixth most violent. Is that right?
Yes, it's, I believe, Morelia itself and Uruapan contribute to over half of the number of homicides that occur in that state.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. Max, over to you.
Yeah, so this week, as always, has been plenty going on. So we saw a Syrian government offensive in the north of Syria, as well as the ongoing coronavirus outbreak, which seems to be particularly concentrated in Asia itself. But today I wanted to draw attention to insecurity around in Pakistan in the border region with Afghanistan by focusing on a suicide bombing incident that took place earlier this week in the city of Quetta. So the incident was a suicide bomber detonated explosives close to a rally of a group called Al-Sunnah wal Jamaat, or ASWJ, and killed approximately 10 people, wounding 25 others. Exact casualty figures aren't clear, but often the case in this region is the casualty figures vary depending on the outlet that you get your news from. So we don't know who did it yet, but what we do know that the ASWJ group is quite an interesting group, and they appear to have been the target, although at first initial reporting wasn't sure if they were the target or if they just happened to be nearby when it went off. So the ASWJ is a group that's affiliated with militant groups from back in the 80s in Pakistan that targeted Shia militant groups. So previously they've been quite a violent group, and they are believed to still maintain links with these violent militant groups. With this said, the leader of the group, who used to be on a terror watch list from the Pakistan government, has been removed in more recent years. So the group is now more of a political movement, albeit with links to violent militant groups. With this group's background in mind, it's probably got no shortage of enemies, but with this said, we still aren't sure who carried out the attack because there's been no official claim of responsibility.
So based on that, whatever groups are active in the area?
So the biggest groups you got really in the area are the Islamic State, Pakistan province, who have been quite active. They themselves actually carried out another suicide bombing similar to this in early January 2020. They have a series of cells that operate in the area. You've got the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP, sometimes known as the Pakistani Taliban. And they're active in the area as well, although typically they've not carried out this sort of attack. But with that said, it's not impossible that they could be responsible. And there's also the Baloch Revolutionary Army, which is a Baloch separatist group who aren't normally involved in this sort of incident. They tend to target Pakistani security forces. But again, possibly could have some negative relationship with the ASWJ, so it's not beyond the pale of possibility. There's a host of other smaller groups, but these are the main three, and all three of them have been active this year in the region.
Thank you, Max. I thought it'd actually be a good opportunity to just demonstrate a feature of the platform and the ability to actually track the activity of various groups, such as those that Max has just mentioned. What you can see on the screen at the moment is the incident that happened in Quetta. If we go into the full detail, you've got a section called Involved Parties. Within here, you can add groups or individuals, and you can also highlight if an individual is part of a group. But we can also make it clear that if the group was an actor, whether they were directly targeted or whether they were actually indirectly affected by the incident. And then by filtering, using the kind of extensive filtering options within the platform, you can actually then set up alerts for various kind of groups and entities. But we'll go over to Scott now. Scott, you're discussing quite a recent incident with us this week, is that right?
Yes, so yesterday evening in the city of Hanau, around about 10 o'clock, there was two incidents of mass shooting that left around 9 people dead and 6 injured, although that has not been verified at this time. The suspect has been identified as a 43-year-old man, identified as Tobias R. He has also since been found dead at his property alongside his mother in an apparent suicide murder. Motive appears to be extreme right-wing ideology. He left behind a letter and a video kind of outlining the reasons for his attack. The attacks themselves seem to have been targeting Turkish or Kurdish nationals at 2 shisha bars in the city and outlying area of Kesselstadt.
How common are these attacks in Germany?
These kind of mass attacks are not particularly common, although right-wing extremism is quite prevalent throughout Germany. The German Domestic Intelligence Agency recently identified that right-wing extremism as at its highest level since 1945.
And within the platform, you can actually use we're monitoring the trend of right-wing extremism within the themes tool. And you can actually view that as a heat map. And obviously there is quite a concentration there on Germany. So yeah, as part of that theme, you can actually see the incident that Scott has just described to us. It's also being monitored as part of a neo-Nazi activity trend and the wider trend of terrorism in 2020. Anything else you guys have seen this week that you think might be worth mentioning? Any other interesting incidents that you've came across during your day-to-day operations?
So in Brazil, just yesterday, 3 children were shot and wounded after being struck by stray bullets while at school. And that's one thing that I've kind of noticed recently in Rio de Janeiro, was that there's been quite a few civilians struck by stray gunfire. The police is often blamed for kind of the way they operate within the favelas, which civilians within those communities and kind of civilians in general and the police don't quite get along. So there's friction between the groups, and security operations have taken place quite often within the favelas. But security measures don't seem to be changed by the government or in response to any of these incidents where civilians get wounded, with children being quite often the victims so far this year.
Max, you actually mentioned Syria earlier in the podcast. What's been happening there?
Yeah, so there's the last rebel-held stronghold is the northeast of Syria in the Aleppo-Idlib area. And what's basically happening right now is the Syrian government have just launched a massive Russian-backed offensive. And what makes this quite controversial is the Turks have what they call observation points, which are essentially Turkish small bases in this rebel-held area. And these are being surrounded by the Syrian government forces, leading to Turkish forces directly firing at Syrian government forces. And this is a bit of a change to what we've seen in the past, where it's been proxies, so Turkish-backed rebels have fired at Syrian forces, etc., whereas this is direct confrontations between the two. So we're expecting to see quite a big increase in tensions between Turkey, the Syrian government, and Russia, and the Syrian government's Russian allies. So this really does have the potential to escalate quite significantly if it's not handled by both sides with a bit of care.
Where does the US fall in that kind of?
The US has taken a really, very much taken a back foot in Syria since they withdrew from northern Syria. So the US is still carrying out patrols in the Hasaka region, which is not quite where the fighting is taking place. And there's been a few incidents where Russian patrols have actually been on the same road as US military patrols. And generally this happens without incident, but there's been a few videos released of Russian BTRs being rammed by American MRAPs. So again, the Americans perhaps not so much involved in this offensive, but there's scope for tensions there between them and the Russians still as well. So it's a lot of international actors with a lot of very different goals in a very small part of the world.
And I think that concludes Insight Weekly, episode 9. Please don't forget to like, share and comment on our video. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.